Talpra magyar, híja haza. Itt az idő, most vagy soha. Rabok legyünk, vagy szabadok. Ez a kérdés, válaszotok. A magyarok istenére esküszünk. Esküszünk, hogy rabok tovább nem leszünk. Yup, this was Hungary. Molotovs being thrown, shells exploding, Russians yelling, the whole 9 yards. You might be wondering how they got in this mess. Well, to understand that, we have to go back to a much simpler time without smartphones, twerking, or hot chips. The year is 1944. For the past 4 years, Hungary has been waging a war in an effort to regain their lost territory, alongside the forces of funny Austrian mustache man and male pattern baldness man.
Sono io la minaccia.
Unfortunately for them, much like 30 years prior, they once more backed the wrong course, and at the moment are receiving an ass kicking of a lifetime, and their government is about to be toppled. Let's forward a little bit. The year now is 1947. War in Europe had just ended, and Hungary was turned from a monarchy without a king into a democracy without free elections. Headed by this guy, Mátyás Rákosi, leader of the Hungarian Communist Party. Over the past couple of years, Mátyás was securing his power throughout the country with the help of the USSR. Until finally in 1945, he won the elections with only 70% of the vote. Shortly after his victory, he and the party founded the Államvédelmi Hatóság, aka the AVH, which would serve as the country's state protection authority, which is just fancy talk for secret police. We'll come back to those guys later. Soon after the commies took power, they decided to merge with the Hungarian Social Democratic Party to form the Hungarian Working People's Party, with whom they secured complete power and with the help of the USSR proclaimed Hungary into a socialist state. Over the next decade, the government implemented a variety of changes. First and foremost, like any good communist government does, they banned all other political parties. Then they abolished most checks and balances and gave Rákosi unlimited power to rule over the country. Because remember kids, all Hungarians are equal, but some are more equal than others.
Édes kislányom, neked ugye van még spórolt pénzed?
A papa már mind elkunyizta.
Mire?
Horgász engedélyre.
Following the commie to-do list, Mátyás then commenced a political purge where he would dispose of over 7,000 people in an attempt to get rid of political rivals, the most notable of which was Reich László, the founder of the AVH, an immensely more popular politician than Rákosi. Following this, the secret police would then go on to imprison 100,000 people, where 1 out of 5 families would have a member taken to a concentration camp or a forced labor mine. Alongside that, the state would also go on and forcibly evict over 26,000 people from their homes and fill them with party and AVH members. But all of that fails in comparison to what they did to the economy. With the adoption of a socialist constitution based on the USSR one, the Working People's Party also embraced an economy on Stalinist principles. Like many other Soviet satellite states, Hungary's economy's main strength lay in agriculture and textiles at the time. Yet, like with many other planned economies, this aspect was ignored and replaced with heavy industry in an effort to quickly industrialize the nation, which resulted in diminishing living standards and disposable income as the distribution of resources was managed quite poorly. Also, the majority of the industrial products produced were not kept within the country, but rather exported to the USSR in preparation for the war against the evil capitalists. The situation worsened across the country as shortages of consumer goods became rampant. Not only did the Hungarians have less money than before, but now they didn't even have groceries that they could buy with the money they had left. The country's fiscal situation was further weakened as the USSR and other neighboring nations forced the state to pay war reparations, which cost Hungary annually 22% of its GDP. Alongside that, the country's leadership refused American financial aid via the Marshall Plan due to ideological reasons, which angered even more Hungarians. However, Tensions started cooling down for a brief time. As Stalin passed away in 1953, Hungary started to de-Stalinize alongside the rest of the Iron Curtain. Protests started popping up all over the country, showing their discontent with the state's leadership, which ultimately forced Rákosi to step down as prime minister and be replaced by Nagy Imre. Now, Imre was a favored replacement due to being an outspoken reformer. As he took power, he shifted Hungary's production effort from heavy industry to consumer goods in an effort to boost supply to fit the demand. Alongside that, Imre also started to liberalize the economy by allowing collective farms to disband if they so wished and allowing free markets with certain goods. He also received a boost in popularity by levying taxes on the peasantry and releasing political prisoners, the Rákosi, previously imprisoned in labor camps. In addition to that, Nagy also closed many of the camps altogether. Beside all of those reforms, Imre also pushed for the liberalization of the media and government by giving more freedom to the press and advocating for the reintroduction of oppositionary political parties. As you can imagine, this wave of reform didn't last for too long, as the USSR and many hardline communists within Hungary started feeling threatened by Nagy, as they feared that his reforms would inspire others to distance themselves from the path of communist righteousness. Thus, in 1955, Nagy got deposed from office by the USSR under the pretense of economic mismanagement and was replaced once more by Mátyás Rákosi.
Jó napot kívánok, PSD!
Evidently, this didn't sit well with the Hungarian people, and discontent with the government once more started to rise. Tensions within the country continued to rise as a secret speech held by the first secretary of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, where he heavily criticized Stalin and his policies, got leaked, which heavily enraged the populace, as a result of which Rákosi once more was forced out of the office and replaced by his close ally, Ernő Gerő. Now, Gerő too was also quite unpopular, as many saw him as indistinguishable from Rákosi and practically saw him as just a cosmetic change within the government rather than a systematic one. Soon after he took office, Ernő started to reverse many of Imre's policies, which prompted many of Hungarians' youth to organize throughout Budapest and the country. Reformist groups of students named Petőfi circles started to pop up and discuss ways to fix the country and its problems. Their numbers grew exponentially after the Poznan Uprising in Poland, where Polish workers were able to gain concessions from the USSR to the country and win some of their rights back. Inspired by their friends from the north and emboldened by their sheer numbers, it was time. Something had to change. In mid-October, students throughout Hungary founded and joined the Union of Hungarian University Academy Students, MEFES. The union proclaimed and spread a 20-demand manifesto demanding free elections and departure of Soviet troops from Hungary. Many other unions followed suit and proclaimed support for the student manifesto. Thus, on October 23, 1956, around 20,000 protesters from Budapest and around the country congregated at the statue of József Bem, where the president of the Writers' Union read out the manifesto to the audience demanding Hungarian sovereignty, democratic socialism, and freedom and rights to the Hungarian people, amongst other things. Upon his proclamation, the crowd burst into song, chanting, "Esküszünk! Esküszünk, hogy tovább rabok nem leszünk." A couple of hours later, Ernő would go on to the national radio and condemn the protesters.
De én most bemegyek, azt megölöm a polgármestert. Mi van? Azért van, hogy a szegény embereknek meg legyen teremtve.
Angered by Ernő's response, one group of protesters rushed to the Városliget Park, where they tore down an 8-meter tall statue of Joseph Stalin, starkly displaying public discontent with the regime. The other group relocated outside of the Magyar Radio building, where they demanded to be allowed to enter and broadcast their demands to the country. Guarded by the AVH, The protesters were refused entry except for their delegation, who was allowed to enter the building. As the crowd grew stronger, the AVH started using water cannons to disperse the students. However, right after rumors started to spread that their delegation was murdered by the secret police, the dissidents stormed the building, prompting the AVH to throw tear gas from the upper floors and start shooting live bullets, killing 8 as the crowd started to disperse and take cover. Soon after, the streets of Budapest were filled with sounds of sirens as ambulances rushed to the radio building. However, something seemed odd about these ambulances. Many of these doctors seemed to wear green uniforms underneath their white mantles, and many seemed to be carrying suspicious-looking cargo into the radio building. As several protesters started inspecting, it turned out that the AVH was posing as first aid workers and supplying their comrades within the building with more guns and ammunition. Furious with the discovery, the students swiftly attacked the imposters, seizing their supplies and arming themselves, and returning fire. Running low on supplies, having their supply chain cut off, and pinned down by their own bullets, the AVH had no other choice but to call in for reinforcements. Shortly, a column of military trucks started rolling down the streets of Budapest. The Hungarian army was heading to the site of the protest to intervene, followed by 3 of their tanks. Upon arriving at the fighting site, instead of opening fire on the protesters, many soldiers tore down their Red Star insignia and joined the protesters upon 2 of their officers proclaiming not to harm the rioters. As word of the fighting spread, many workers throughout the city rushed to join their fellow countrymen at the Magyar radio. On their way, they encountered the other military convoys also heading to the same location, who then too proceeded to arm their comrades before battle, giving out guns and ammo to the people. Soon, the people severely outnumbered the AVH and outgunned them. Forced into a corner on the verge of losing power, Ernő pleaded for military support to help suppress the uprising. Thus, the next day, on the 24th of October, the Red Army crossed into Hungary and headed for Budapest. By noon, they occupied most bridges and crossroads leading into the capital. As they closed into the city, many put up barricades to provide cover and slow down the invaders. The same day, Nagy Imre was once more appointed as Prime Minister of the country in an effort to ease the situation. Upon his accession into office, he pleaded with the revolutionaries to cease fighting, but it was to no avail. As the Red Army made its way through Budapest, they shot numerous unarmed civilians and protesters, which just made more Hungarians join the fight and shoot back. The next day, on the 25th of October, a large group of protesters organized at the Astoria Hotel, where they were confronted by 8 Soviet tanks. Instead of fighting, the 2 groups engaged in conversation where the protesters asked the soldiers why they were firing on peaceful demonstrators. In a surprising turn of events, the Red Unit sympathized with the Hungarian people and allowed them to proceed onto the parliament and oust the Stalinists from the government, upon which the protesters painted the tanks in Hungarian colors and insignia, and many even climbed on top of them, fraternizing with their crews. Together they made their way to Kossuth Square in front of the parliament, where over 20,000 people were gathered, half of whom were women and children, all waiting for Nagy to show up. The parliament itself was guarded by 7 tanks keeping their protesters at bay. Alongside that, on top of the surrounding buildings, several AVH members and Soviet soldiers were stationed. For a while the situation was calm. Many protesters socialized with the soldiers, making conversation with them and handing them bilingual leaflets in both Russian and Hungarian. Upon one of the Soviet generals seeing such a sight, he ordered the army to immediately open fire on the demonstrators. In an instant, the square devolved into chaos as tanks blasted and machine gun fire mowed down the civilians. In a couple of minutes, over 800 people were dead. With this massacre, over the next couple of days, the city devolved into total war as flames from Molotov cocktails engulfed Soviet tanks and bullets flew across the streets. Workers across the country, led by revolutionary worker councils, went into strike in support of their countrymen fighting in the streets of Budapest. Civil militia groups sprawled up, killing Soviet sympathizers and AVH members. Heads were rolling left and right, which forced Ernő and the ex-Prime Minister Hegedűs to flee from the country into the USSR. On the 27th of October, the rebels succeeded in recapturing most of the Soviet and AVH outposts and successfully seized the parliament, collapsing the government and reinstalling Nagy, who was previously detained by Communist Party members. The next day, an agreement was signed between Nagy and the Soviet government, where Nagy vowed to restore order to the country by forming a new government composed of several oppositionary non-communist parties, disarm the rebels, and dissolve the AVH and replace them with a new National Guard made up by police, military, and previous rebels. Alongside this, over 8,000 political prisoners were to be released and previously banned political parties were to be reinstated. For a couple of days, it seemed like the people won. Hungary was about to enter a new liberal age, freed from the shackles of autocracy. However, things didn't stay as such for too long. Among the freed political prisoners was General Béla Király. Under his orders, the National Guard stormed the building of the Communist Party's Central Committee and killed every pro-Soviet officer, AVH policeman, and soldier. Upon the news of the Soviet sympathizers being massacred within Hungary reached the Union, the USSR's administration shifted its previously tolerant policy regarding Hungary. The straw that finally broke the camel's back was that Nagy proclaimed that Hungary wished to secede from the Warsaw Pact and declare neutrality. Thus, on November 1st, Soviet troops were once more mobilized and heading towards Budapest. Immediately, Hungary officially proclaimed its secession from the Warsaw Pact and declared itself as a neutral country, sending cries of help to the UN and the West. By the 3rd of November, the Red Army completely surrounded Budapest. The next day, a barrage of artillery and tank fire ravaged the city, leaving almost no district unscathed. As Soviet infantry entered the city, around 15,000 Hungarians put up a fight. Defending the Corvin passage, 4,000 men shot invaders through the windows and threw a barrage of Molotov cocktails, downing 12 tanks and inflicting heavy casualties upon the Russians. Yet, as bombs fell from the sky and mortars blasted their positions, the Hungarian army could not hold up for too long against the superior firepower of the USSR. During the fighting, Nagy once more pleaded to the United Nations, but nothing came to Hungary other than the condemnation of the USSR's actions. The fighting lasted until the 11th of November, when the last rebel stronghold was defeated. In the end, Hungary's casualties boasted over 2,500 dead and over 20,000 wounded. More than half of the dead were civilians, and around 53 of the dead were also younger than 30 years old. In the late states of the fighting, Nagy Imre and several other members from his cabinet took refuge in Yugoslavia's embassy. However, on November the 22nd, while attempting to leave the building, they were arrested by the Soviets. Despite their previous guarantees of safe passage, they were all taken to Romania, where they awaited trial for 2 years. In 1958, Nagy was executed along several others and buried in an unmarked grave outside of Budapest. Following the revolution, Kádár János was installed as the Prime Minister of Hungary, loyal to the Soviet Union. Several purges took place, eradicating collaborators with the previous regime and dissenters. The Hungarian army was heavily castrated and the Soviet military presence was excessively increased. Communism and its regime would stay in the country for another 3 decades until they finally fell in 1989. When it comes to the Hungarian Revolution, although it is regularly overshadowed by hundreds of other historical events, it is still arguably one of the most significant events in our history as humankind. As the revolution demonstrates the inescapable human drive for justice and freedom, even under the circumstances of losing everything with just one bullet in the heart, is still something worth pursuing to your final breath. May eternal glory be bestowed upon those who fought and fell against tyranny. A magyarok istenére esküszünk. Esküszünk, hogy rabok tovább nem leszünk. Once more, I wish to thank all the members for continually supporting the channel. If you enjoy what I do, consider becoming a member like these lovely people. If not, go and purchase yourself a shirt from theironicsshop.com to help fund future videos and travels. Also, a big shout out to Estonia Ball Animations for helping in the creation of this video and providing some awesome animations. Go check him out on YouTube. My name is János, and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.
Hey, why